Good morning. It's a rainy, well, it's not raining now, but it has clearly rained here in Gothenburg. And I'm happy to announce that, well, happy and happy. I've progressed to the last stage in the Klarna recruitment process, which means that I'm supposed to go up to Stockholm for a full day of interviewing, which, well, although it sounds interesting, I've contacted them and said that, like, just making sure that they're gonna pay for my travel expenses and all that stuff. And some of you may ask me, "Oh, Fredrik, why do you do that?" Oh, and it's because of a previous video where I said that I'm done with these crazy recruiters and their crazy requirements and the companies who are just insane when it comes to, like, I mean, if it's my absolute dream job, then yes, but no more. Like, I'm not paying people for the chance to prove that I'm good enough to work at their company anymore, which was the case with Meltwater, and it's the case with Klarna, but I'm pretty sure that they're going to pay for my travel expenses. Anywho, I thought we were going to talk a little bit about trying to be clever, or trying to rather, there's a term called premature optimization, and that's a very generic term that describes a solution that is either more complicated or provides a perceived value that may or may not be required for a certain feature. And that's very generic, but let's say that you're building a web page, and let's say that it's a standard web page, loads just fine. You don't really have much in terms of a loading performance problem or anything like that. And then you decide to add some asynchronous loading scripts onto the page, even though you're already hitting the required marks. That, to some people, would call that premature optimization, because there's no problem and you're optimizing for that thing. And it's the same thing with you're using a for loop in JavaScript with a lot of like internal logic instead of using an array method like for each or something of that nature. And the motivation behind it is there's nothing wrong with using a for loop, but like if your mentality is that it's more performant because under the hood that's a bit faster, once again, that's premature optimization. And the most, in my opinion, dangerous thing that you can do when it comes to premature optimization is to go for reusability and making things generic. And I see this quite a bit where, and I'm gonna be honest, like I was the same when I first started out. I tried to make things generic and reusable because you're taught in school that that's what you should be doing. You should make reusable code, it should be dry and all that good stuff. However, if you don't know from experience when a generic solution is the way to go, you find yourself often breaking my most important rule. And I hope it's the same rule for most developers, and that is that you break simplicity. You make things more complicated than they have to be. And I keep on, you're gonna hear me say this a lot. Simplicity is almost always better, because the true problem for most growing applications is it's not that they're not performant enough. For the most part, it's that they become so complicated or so poorly designed that the development process slows down to a grind, basically, which is the case at my job. That's exactly like I'm working on some stuff today, and I did yesterday, where like the problem and the code that I have to write is so simple, but because of how complicated the code is and the structure, it becomes very difficult for me to debug. It becomes difficult for me to change anything because it's so complicated. Anywho, the most concrete example of this I can give you is if you're designing a modal that is supposed to be shown on a web page. That's a classic what I call situation for where you'll show me very quickly what type of developer you are, because a modal window in general will have a few different requirements. You'll have a alert for like an error modal, an information modal, and you might have a warning modal. You have different types of modals that you want to show up, and in general you'll see two solutions to this problem. The bad solution, or yeah, it's not bad, but the worst solution is that you have a single modal component, and then you basically pass the you configure the modal component in such a way that everything, all the code and all the requirements for all those three different types of modals are living in the same modal, and then you have internal conditions for when you're showing what. The reason why this is bad is because all of a sudden if the requirements change, and they usually do for different, you have different content and you have different layouts and styling and so forth, all that internal complexity grew by 3 times in one single component now. So do you see what I'm saying? Like if you had 3 separate files with 3 separate modals, you would have a problem that you could slice in 3, like it would be a third of the problem. But now you have 3 times the problem, and it's going to grow and grow from there. What you're basically doing is that you're trying to be generic before there's a requirement to do so. The better solution is to create a template where basically you have a file that represents the things that are specific to the modal. Usually that's the header part where you usually see a color or like an icon or something. That you make a separate component and you say, okay, I can give this a value saying that I want you to look like this or that and so forth. And then you create a container, and in that container you have you put 2 things for the modal, the header at the top and then the content part at the bottom. And then the content itself is also a container where you put like the text or the HTML or whatever is going to be in there. And because you build things up from these smaller components, these fairly generic components, but that are not trying to do too much, you can actually create what I like composed components or compound components, where you use these same blocks to build up these different modals without any real code duplication whatsoever. And the reason why you want to do this is because you're trying to solve the specific problem first. You're not trying to create an abstraction, or you're not assuming that you know how this component is going to work in the future. So you're guarding yourself so that anyone who wants to build more of these modals has that opportunity. It's a subtle difference, but try to think about these things, because trust me, being generic when you start building things often ends badly.